Welcome, everybody. We are going to start getting rolling here. I want to thank you all for joining us for the third Write-a-thon Q&A with an instructor. If this is your first session, welcome. If not, welcome back. My name is Jay Steinbacher. I am the workshop manager at Clarion West, and we are almost to the end of the Write-a-thon. If you're writing with us this year, give us an update on your progress, or you can drop a link to your page in the chat. Um, Oops, sorry. Getting distracted by the chat. And I have joined the Write-a-thon, but because I am the workshop manager, it's more of an excuse to fundraise than to write for me. I'm hoping many of you are getting tons of words done. I will be working on those words when I finally get a break in August. But so far with the Write-a-thon, we have 122 participants, and we've raised just over $11,600 in support of Clarion West for scholarships, year-round access seats, and sliding scale tuition, unlocking this Write-a-thon reward Q&A session with Charlie Jane Anders. And I hope you are getting questions ready. Please use the Q&A feature, which you will see at the bottom of your screen. It's much easier to track questions with the Q&A than if you put them in chat. They might get swallowed if folks start to get particularly excited. And thanks again for joining us. So I have a couple questions I can kick us off with, and then we can move to the rest of y'all. Hi, Charlie Jane.
Hi, it's so lovely to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's great to have you. Also, factoid, Charlie Jane was one of my 6-week instructors
It's
too long ago. We shouldn't even say the year, but it's been over a decade. It's kind of
been a
amazing.
while. Gosh, time is weird.
Um, so I will ask then, do you have a favorite Clarion West memory that you'd like to share?
Oh my God. I mean, I think it has to be the karaoke. Actually, literally, I was trying to tell somebody about this the other day because they were asking about karaoke in Seattle. Like, I forget who it was that was like, where do you go for karaoke in Seattle? And I was like, well, we went to this weird bar that was like nautical themed. It was like a mermaid bar, but it was full of like cowboys who kind of harassed some of us. But the karaoke itself was wonderful. I like basically was like the thing I want to do as an instructor is I want to take people out for karaoke. And, Hugh and everybody else made it happen. And yeah, and I got to, some of the performances were just are indelibly burned into my brain because they were so great. Like I discovered some real talent among the students that I hadn't been aware of.
I do have some memories from that night too, but not of my singing talent. Um, so how do you think a workshop like Clarion West can help writers achieve their goals?
Oh gosh, I mean, I feel like um, it connects you to community. That's one thing. Like the people I know who've done Clarion West have like, they have a posse. They have a whole community that they're connected to. Ideally, if you do Clarion West, you're not just like getting to be in community with your classmates and hopefully your instructors, but also you're going to like events, you're going to readings, you're meeting people in the larger Seattle science fiction scene, and hopefully, and you go to conventions together and you meet people at conventions, and hopefully it just like helps you to get more connected to other writers and other people who love this genre. That's my main thing that I think it is. I mean, I think it's also got all these benefits for craft in terms of like just the intensive critiquing and just like strengthening your critical skills as well as your writing skills, like learning to kind of like understand what's working or what's potentially needs to work better in order to come through in someone else's story. It can help you to get better at understanding how to make your own stories better. So I feel like that's also a huge benefit for sure.
Yeah, we're in week 5 of the summer workshop.
Oof.
I
Oh
know.
man.
And at this point, I see our students really like they have the confidence now to speak up in critiques and really feel like they can weigh in on each other's work.
Amazing.
Yeah.
I
Whereas
love it.
early
That's
on,
awesome.
it's they're not quite at that point, but now it's like, oh, I know enough about this that I can speak to it.
Sure.
Um, so we I see some 6-week folks in the audience, and you may or may not know that we have a novel workshop these days. This year was our first kickoff, so it's still running. They're kind of in their summer writing break. But as someone who writes many different lengths, do you have any advice that you feel you could offer both to short fiction writers and novel writers?
I mean, I feel like, I mean, just writing like advice in general, I feel like when you're going from short fiction to novels, you have to, there's more middle. And so like the longer you go, the more middle there is. And I feel like when I started out writing only short stories, and my short stories were often very like, you know, very kind of like racing towards the ending from the very first sentence. That was kind of the style I started out with. And, I got better at writing endings as a result of writing like 100 short stories in like a few years, many of which were terrible, most of which were terrible and luckily never got published or got published in really tiny places. But I feel like, I mean, when you're working on a novel, the thing I always say is that the ending is kind of the beginning. The ending is where you find out what the novel's really about and what it's really, you know, what all of this is driving toward. And I'm somebody who really believes in endings as kind of a defining thing, where it's kind of the thing you're leaving people with. And so, then the purpose of all that middle is to make that ending feel earned, or make it feel like everything has led up to this. And so you need a middle that like supports that, not doesn't just move the places into peace so that the ending can happen, but also like asks the questions that the ending is answering, kind of. And so I feel like that's the thing with novels. And I think with short fiction, it's the same thing, but it can often be much more like straightforward, because you can have a short story where the first 3 or 4 paragraphs set something up that is kind of paid off by the ending, and it can be more of a straight line sometimes, although obviously not always.
Thank you. Yeah, I feel like every year we get a bunch of folks in the short fiction workshop who are like, "Well, I'm actually a novelist, but
Oh, right. Yeah, of course.
um,
Huh.
but now that we have a novel workshop too,
That's
it's like."
awesome. I didn't know that y'all were doing that. That's so cool.
Yeah, Samit Basu is our instructor this year, and
Oh
we'll
my
be
gosh.
announcing next year's instructor at
Oh
our
my
event next
gosh.
week with Martha Wells
Amazing.
and Kate Elliott. So stay tuned for that if you are in the audience and you're interested. So you mentioned that writing Lessons in Magic and Disaster while you were also writing Never Say You Can't Survive informed your writing process. I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah, I talked about that in my newsletter, I guess the other day, or was it last week? No, I think it was the other day. I talked about that in my newsletter, which you can read at buttondown.com/Charlie Jane. And yeah, I mean, the I literally like it was 2020, gosh, interesting year. And I I was simultaneously trying to like write the third book of my young adult trilogy, Promise is Stronger Than Darkness, but then I had these 2 other projects I was working on. I had decided to just pitch this idea for a writing advice book specifically about getting through bad times. And, it I kind of came up with that idea at the end of 2019 or the start of 2020, and then it became obvious that 2020 was like a good year to kind of launch something like that, because it was such a terrible time. And unfortunately, I don't think that book has gotten less relevant since then, unfortunately. And so I was working on that and basically writing an essay a week or a chapter a week of that. And then but I also just like I had this novel in mind about a young woman who teaches her mother how to do magic. And that was something that I kind of had noodled on a tiny bit in 2019, but I started writing it in earnest in 2020. And, I would work on the young adult book at my computer during the day. And then I would write the essays for Never Say You Can't Survive. Yeah, that's my cat, Orcus Aurelius, just coming to say hi. He always likes to Zoom bomb all my Zooms. Like, yeah. And So I was writing the young adult on my computer during the day, and then I would take a long walk and work on my essay, kind of just dictating, like doing speech to text on my phone. And then at night I would get into bed with some like a little glass of whiskey and just kind of scribble in a notebook for lessons in magic and disaster. And I feel going back and forth between different methods of writing and different styles of writing and different kind of approaches to writing is always really fun. It keeps you kind of from getting too in a rut, and also like things turn out really differently if you write them on a computer versus longhand in a pen and ink. Like it's just a different feeling. It's a different process. You write a little bit more free association maybe when you're writing pen and ink, and like there's fewer distractions. You can't go back and edit. It's a very different situation. And it just feels more kind of small and intimate in a way. But basically, yeah, Never Say You Can't Survive was this book about it was all about using stories to get through hard times and kind of getting lost in a story and kind of channeling some of your feelings that you're having into the story you're working on. And all of that was definitely going on. Like I talk about lessons in magic and disaster in Never Say You Can't Survive. I talk about it as my work in progress at the time. And so like I was using all of those techniques as I was writing about them, but also I feel like the heart of Never Say You Can't Survive is that it's a story about kind of trying to find the meaning in your own story and in the stories that you're like. The main character is a grad student who's studying this one 300-year-old novel and is trying to understand it. And, you know, and just the thing of like trying to, use stories to get through a tough time. I feel like that's a theme that runs through the novel as well. And it's very much about, and, also the novel is about kind of rebuilding your connections with other people. And I feel like Lessons in Magic and Disaster is all about like the power of human connection and how it can kind of save us. So I feel like the two things were, I saw them as being in dialogue as I was working on them both at the same time. And I definitely saw them as being kind of, you know, complementary projects or even two halves of the same project. So I'm really glad that you can finally read them both like back to back or side or alongside each other or whatever.
Yeah, we will find a pre-order link for your novel.
Yay.
When does it come out?
Yeah. Comes out August 19th, so less than a month now. Gosh,
That's
coming
during
up.
Worldcon?
It's right after Worldcon, but you can come see our reading on August 14th and get an early copy. And that's Thursday evening at Town Hall Seattle.
That's awesome. That's the Writers with Drinks event, right?
Yeah,
Yeah, I will
sure
also
is.
find a link to that one to put in the chat.
Nice.
But looks like we have a question from an audience member.
Yay.
Amanda Andonian is asking, how do you stay engaged with your creativity when you don't feel connected to it or when it feels hard to access?
That's a really good question. And I think that's something I thought about a lot when I was working on Never Say You Can't Survive in 2020, but it's definitely, I think, gotten more problematic since then because there's just so much, you know, it's so much scary stuff and so much pressure and so much like precarity and just feeling of like everything is kind of messed up and a lot of us are just kind of trying to survive. So it's really hard to access that creative part of yourself right now. And I feel like there's a bunch of different answers. One answer that I've been thinking about a lot lately is that it's not just about accessing the creative part of yourself. It's like about kind of like just staying curious and open and like interested in the world. Because, when you're feeling stressed and anxious and under threat, the world kind of shrinks down to like a really tiny point, and all you can see is the stuff that you're stressed about. And like just allowing yourself, finding ways to just tune out the world and be curious about like different species of bird or like, just different like, weird historical stuff or, anything that's not like the immediate like horrible disasters that are you know threatening our existence right now. Just like thinking about like other like being curious about stuff that's not directly connected to anything can really just help you to kind of like let go of that feeling of like just being trapped in this reality. I also think in general, the more you do it, the easier it is to do. And I feel like the habit of writing and just getting into that mind space, it's almost like a muscle that you can strengthen by just doing it a lot. And so if you make a habit of writing regularly, not necessarily every day, not necessarily like in a rigid schedule, but like I find that having little rituals for writing is really helpful for like just getting me into a mind space of like I've got my cup of tea, I took a nice long walk, I've got my music, I've got like, my cat, everything is kind of chill, and I'm kind of in a headspace where I can just like zone out and write. And I just, the thing I talk a lot about, Never Say You Can't Survive, is just being curious about your characters, and like that curiosity about like wanting to know more about like weird species of birds can also feed into like just I'm curious about what's going to happen next with these characters I'm writing. I'm curious about what's really going on with this person I invented who, seems to want to do something different from what they what you'd expect them to be doing, and like what's going on with that, and like what's the real reason this person ran away from home, and like just you kind of create mysteries for yourself to like solve through writing the story. And I feel like curiosity is an underrated value, like part of being creative and just like holding yourself together during scary times. But there's a million things. It's just like it's mostly just about like trying to like clear your mind and just let yourself kind of like get like kind of zone out and just think about what you're writing, and not just sometimes productivity is just staring into space until things come to you, and it's hard and weird. I don't know.
I feel like Adrienne Marie Brown is also somebody who talks a lot about this. So for those of you in
Oh
the
wow, okay, I'm in
chat,
good company.
yeah, but I'm thinking about our class, and we've got like we've got some philosophers and some therapists and some deep thinkers in there, and it's like really if you are just so curious about what's happening in your work and asking those questions, you can discover things that are much more interesting than if you just forced your way through to a certain answer. Um, let's see. I don't see any other Q&A questions yet, but I can certainly ask you more questions.
Sure.
Um, so I'm curious because I am a fan of the podcast. Can you tell us a little more about Our Opinions Are Correct, and maybe a recent episode that you want to plug?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like it's been really fun doing that podcast for the last, like, gosh, like 6 years. My partner Annalie and I used to run a website together called IO9, which was kind of about, it was like a news website about science fiction and science and futurism, and eventually we added fantasy. And it was like, I worked there for nearly 9 years, gosh, and Hulk Hogan, who just died today, kind of played a role in destroying that job. So it's kind of interesting. Like I was just thinking about that. And after we both left that company, Annalie and I were kind of off doing our own things, and we didn't collaborate on anything for like a couple of years, but we kept talking about like what else could we do together, and we thought maybe we could do a podcast. We had a bunch of different ideas for podcasts. One of our ideas for a podcast was going to be like a weird audio drama about like, Anna Lee had this idea of like a retelling of the novel Middlemarch from the point of view of these security cameras in a high-tech building, and like Middlemarch as retold through the lives of all the people living in this big high-tech high-rise with like, artificially intelligent like security cameras, like kind of gossiping about everything that was going on. And that was such a fun concept. And we could still do that at some point. I feel like it was so like weird and interesting. And I would have loved to do that. But then we kind of pivoted to doing this thing where we're just going to geek out about science fiction and related topics and science sometimes. And, that ended up being, I felt like a good fit because it's something that we can do. We've been able to sustain it for 6 years now. And there's always topics that we want to talk about, that we want to geek out about. And we've had some amazing guests. Like an episode that I want to plug I mean, we had one recently about the supply chain that was super interesting about like what is the supply chain and how does the supply chain show up in, in stories, especially in science fiction and fantasy, but just in general. And we talked to Alexis Madrigal, who just wrote a book about like containerization and, shipping and how being a port has transformed the city of Oakland because it has all these, shipping containers coming in from Asia and how that's kind of changed the fabric of Oakland. And yeah, so that's a really fun episode. I feel like I'm really proud of a bunch of our recent episodes. I was like, I wanted to do something about the blood-brain barrier because I was just like obsessed with what is the blood-brain barrier and like kind of like both the fact that we've learned a lot about the blood-brain barrier in the last like 5 years. Like I think COVID forced us to learn a lot more about this weird thing that protects our brain from like infection or allegedly does. Apparently it's not as perfect as we thought it was. But also people are getting better at getting drugs to go through the blood-brain barrier. But I was also just interested in it as like this Cartesian thing of like, we like to think our brains are totally separate from our bodies and that we are just like, we really are our brains and our bodies are just this thing that we ride around inside, like vehicles that our brains kind of drive around in. And in fact, our brains and our bodies are really integrated. And the notion that the blood-brain barrier is much more kind of permeable and like not as like not a plastic bag as the expert that we talked to, Natasha O'Brown said, it's not like your brain is wrapped in a plastic bag, which sounds like it could be kind of bad actually. There's like, it's complicated and like our brains are part of our bodies and what happens to our nervous system is all over the body and what happens elsewhere in the body affects your brain. And so that was really interesting to learn about. And I see there's another question in the Q&A. And please keep them coming,
Yes.
folks.
Yes. This one's from one of our
I'm
students
just
here.
grabbing more tea. I'm listening.
Absolutely, Nicole Chung. I've been told by a lot of gender diverse authors that publishing's dependency on them to publicly perform personal aspects of one's life for publicity purposes feels really frightening. And yet, your outreach and public persona are such powerful gifts to the community. Can you tell us more about your experience with that?
Oh, wow. So this is specifically about like having a public persona and kind of performing your marginalization or your identity or whatever for, and I think it's interesting because when I heard the first part of that question, I thought this was going to be about like reflecting my gender divergence or my queerness in my work, which is something that I have lots of thoughts about. Are you hearing crackles from me, Evan? I don't know. I just got this headphone. Hopefully it's working okay. Can anybody else hear crackling?
I've
Okay, well, I'm
noticed
just
a
keep talking.
tiny bit here and there, but of course, the minute you ask, we can't hear it. So,
Okay. Okay, well, fingers crossed. Anyway, yeah, I mean, so obviously I feel like my queerness and transness come out in everything I write. Like it's something that just, it's part of who I am. I don't always write explicitly about it. And sometimes the stuff where I don't consciously think I'm writing about it, I'm writing about it a little bit more than I think I am, and vice versa. Like, The City in the Middle of the Night is a book that I thought of as like having themes that kind of interact with queer topics and like transness, but I didn't think of it as like a trans novel. And I feel like I've been kind of blown away by how many trans people have told me that they really see it as like a text that is about transness in a really fundamental way. Versus some things where I was like, this is a story about transness, and people have just been like, oh, it's not about transness, it's about like this other stuff. But in terms of like my public persona, it's so interesting. Last weekend I was at ReaderCon and I was on a panel about basically like public personas and representing yourself, and how you have to like represent yourself as an author in order to promote yourself and or just to exist in the world. And it was a really interesting conversation. We kind of touched on some of this stuff. And I don't know. I mean, I'm a huge believer in just in general with like, I hate the idea of having an authorial brand, quote unquote, because I'm a human being. I'm not like a tube of toothpaste. I wrote a thing about this in my newsletter a while back, which you can, if you just search on how to have a brand without burning out on Button Down, you should be able to find that on Button Down slash Charlie Jane. But, I feel like people are kind of encouraged to overshare in general. Like even, straight cis white people are encouraged to overshare about like personal stuff because that's a good way to like build engagement and make people feel like they know you. And so people will buy your books because it's like, well, I know what kind of cereal this person eats. So I feel like we're like really friends. So I'm going to buy their work. Or, I know about the personal struggles this person is having with like their, you know, with like life stuff, like health stuff, or like problems that they're experiencing in their life. And so I feel like I really care about this author, and so I'm going to buy their work. And it can feel really like genuine and like it's, you're connecting on this like you're actually connecting with people and building community. Like we talked about community earlier. It can also feel a little bit gross and exploitative to be like, I'm going to exploit my personal life for my career. But it really depends how you do it and the spirit in which you do it. But I personally, like, I have been on the internet long enough that I kind of got a lot of oversharing out of my system, like back when I was on LiveJournal, where, thank God on LiveJournal, you could say, I want to show this to these people, but not these people. So that really helped. But I feel like now I'm much more like, I want to preserve my privacy. As far as like, I think that nobody should ever feel like obligated to, to perform their marginalization or to share more than they want to about like their experience as a queer person or as any other kind of marginalized person, just so that people will feel like they are, either being authentic. Like we talked a lot about authenticity on this panel, and it got really interesting, but feel like you're being authentic or feel like you're connecting with people in a way that will make them want to like buy your stuff so you don't like starve. um, but also I feel like nobody should ever share them more than nobody should ever feel obligated to share. I feel like people shouldn't, like, I feel like you should share what you feel comfortable sharing, what you feel an urgency to share. If you have a perspective that you think is important for other people to see, then yeah, of course. I do feel like in recent years, I've wanted to be a little bit more vocal as a trans person, just because so many trans people we're under so much attack, and it's gotten really just super heinous to the point where now I feel like I feel like those of us who have a little bit more privilege or are a little bit more secure can do a lot of good by speaking up and just being a little bit more visible, but also just by existing in the world. I feel like there's no way for me to not be visibly trans in the world and just be like doing my writing and like just moving forward and like existing and creating and hopefully thriving. And I think that's something that it's good for people to see as possible. But I also, I feel like, yeah, I mean, it really does come down for me to the question of authenticity and people, like when it gets to a place of people wanting to like see you be authentically this thing, that's when it gets really toxic and horrible. And you need to just like, those people need to just go away. And really nothing should ever be for other people's like entertainment or amusement. And I also do think that the needs of like the intra community stuff of like, it's helpful for other trans people to see me like talking about this or just like living my life in a particular way versus like cis people who just want to like feel like, oh, I saw a trans person doing, or like, oh, that's interesting. I'm so fascinated by trans people that they can just go jump in a lake as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, co-signed.
Yay. Okay,
We
good.
do have another question that showed up. Um, in Never Say You Can't Survive, you said that the reader must be convinced to trust the narrator. I struggle with earning the reader's trust in my writing. Would you be able to elaborate on ways to convince the reader?
Man, that's such a good question. And it's so interesting because I was just thinking about like, there's been a lot of novels lately. I feel like, one that jumps out at me is Vajra Chandrasekhara's The Saint of Bright Doors, but there's been a bunch lately where the narrator is kind of like there's like a trick with the narrator. Like I feel like I've seen so many novels in the last year or two where, the narrator isn't who you thought it was, or you think it's just like a third person narrator, and it turns out to actually be a first person narrator who's narrating things and doesn't reveal that they're a person until halfway through the book. I just read another book which does that, where I don't want to give spoilers because that's actually a huge spoiler for the book I'm thinking about. And it's hard for me to name specific examples without spoiling big surprises in books that I've read recently. But I feel like it's a thing I've come across a bunch of times lately of like interesting narrator tricks. And I feel like I've also seen a lot more kind of risky narration where it's like a lot of second person narration, a lot of like narration that is kind of, asking more of the reader in different ways. Or, in the case of second person narration, just like addressing the reader lately. And I feel like we're having a moment where narrators are kind of getting to be a little bit more challenging and interesting and kind of strange, I guess I would say. And it's been interesting to watch. I guess, yeah. I mean, in terms of how to get people to trust the narrator, like I did talk about that sub and all, and never say you can't survive. I feel like, I mean, like part of it is that part of it is just the basic thing of like all the little tricks you do to draw someone into the story are also things that make the narrator feel like your friend. And so like if you have a really interesting opening line, like I, when the starship started to like blow up, I realized I really had been a fool not to wear underwear today, or something like that. I don't know. Darn, I should have worn a clean pair of underwear, I thought, as the starship started to explode. Or, just something that's like an interesting opening, like that classic kind of like, oh gosh, I want to see where this goes. And then, the second sentence kind of tells us more information in a way that kind of keeps pulling us in. And then, you just keep getting pulled in by like being told interesting stuff in a way that's kind of colorful and chatty or just like has an interesting voice. I feel like that will make like that thing of like the narrator has something to tell you that's interesting, and they're pulling you into the story by telling you more and more information. That's something that you kind of have to get through practice, which is one of the reasons why I wrote like a billion short stories at one point. Um, yeah, thanks, Cal. And that is the thing I talk about in that book for sure. The opening sentence kind of pulling. I mean, not every story has to do that, but I feel like I love stories that do that. I feel like that's definitely one way to make it work. I feel like, if like I have this gig where I read a lot of books for book reviews, and I will kind of start out with like the first page of like, okay, is this book going to reward my attention for like 300, 400 pages? Am I going to end up wanting to review this book? Because if I'm not going to end up wanting to review this book, I need to move on to another book because I only have so much time to read books and write a review column every month. And like, there'll be books where the first page just kind of feels like a lot of clutter, and I'm just like, ooh, I'm having a hard time getting into this. And then the second page, I'm like, okay, now I'm in. Like, so I have learned that sometimes you got to give something a couple pages to kind of start finding, its footing or whatever, or start kind of like making sense. And some authors will actually push that really far in terms of like, you're going to be confused, and I'm going to make you confused for 3 pages or 20 pages, and then things are going to start falling into place. But I mean, so I feel like, and that can be a totally valid way of like, you know, readers like a thing that I talk about a lot is that readers like to have to do work. Like if you make readers do work, they enjoy it. Like spoon feeding the reader is not always the best way to make the reader be interested and like on board. But that question of trust and that question of trusting the narrator, I think it really does come down to the sense that this is going someplace. You're not going to have the rug pulled out from under you in a way that is frustrating. You might have the rug pulled out from under you in a way that's like, oh my gosh, things went in a direction I didn't expect, and that's really interesting. But it's just the thing of like this is going someplace. There are characters who you're gonna like. I feel like it is partly about like, are there characters you're gonna latch onto who you're gonna care about? Most people, I feel like most of the time we don't think consciously about the narrator unless it's like a first person narrator. We think about the characters, and the job of the narrator is to kind of situate us with the characters so we're following the characters. But I feel like it is really about like, is this going to waste my time? Kind of, and is the narrator going to like carry me on their shoulders or carry me like a little baby through this story in a way that like I'm going to feel like I'm going somewhere and it's going to be a good journey or whatever. So I feel like it's partly about vibes, honestly, but it's partly about just like, you know, giving the reader, whether it's frustrating or spoon feeding or whatever, giving the reader enough that they feel like they are getting somewhere and it's interesting and it's not just going to end up being like, kind of a nothing burger or whatever.
All right, we did get another question from
Yay.
Aniko. One thing that really resonated with me in Never Say You Can't Survive is how weirdness and absurdity can offer comfort. Could you please talk a bit about how you use absurdity as a tool in your work?
Yeah, I love that question. So I used to think of myself as like an absurdist author. Like that was a label that I picked for myself. And a lot of my early stories were very kind of gonzo and kind of like nothing makes sense or things make sense maybe, but it's just weird and kind of disconnected. And, because I do think the world is absurd. Like, and unfortunately, that's becoming easier and easier to see. Like, as you look at like where we are in the world, the absurdity of the world kind of salient, I feel like, for most of us. So yeah, I mean, I feel like, I've talked about this a million times before, so I apologize if this is a repeat, but um, I have this like tension in my own work between absurdity and the thing I talked about a moment ago about like giving a shit about the characters and like wanting to connect with the characters and like I wrote a bunch of stories where the characters were kind of just like a stick figure who was carried along by a bunch of weird events, or a stick figure who's caught up in a bunch of weird events. And like the good version of that is Arthur Dent from like The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Arthur Dent basically has no personality. He's like he wants a cup of tea. That's literally all I can remember about him. I've read that book like several times, I think, over the years, and I feel like Arthur Dent is just like a cipher. He's just there to have stuff happen to him and to be, stuck in the middle of all these like upsetting events. And everything else is so fascinating that you don't care that Arthur Dent is boring. But I at a certain point I was like, I want to write about real people. I want to have real emotion. I want to like bond with my characters. And, that's harder to do when nothing makes sense and just everything is topsy-turvy, because you have to at least like kind of care about what happens to your character. That means that you have to feel like things are happening in a way that there's going to be consequences, or the character cares about stuff that feels like it's real in some sense. Like the surrealism has to at least allow for the character to be. And I feel like I have read some books recently, and it kind of goes back to what I was saying before about narrators being weird and stuff being weird. I have read some books which really push that far in terms of like things being kind of surreal and disorienting, but you still are like on board with the characters because the characters are so vividly drawn. And Saint of Bright Doors is a great example of that. I'm reading a great book right now that really does that incredibly well. Mad Sisters of Essie by Tasha Mesa. I'm halfway through. It's such a great book. But where was I going with that? Yeah, I feel like I pulled way back on the absurdity at a certain point, like maybe around 2010, I guess, late 2000s, early 2010s. And that was when I wrote like 6 Months, 3 Days was a story that has a very absurd premise, but I tried to make it as grounded as possible and tried to like make it as emotional as possible and make the absurdity kind of serve the characters rather than the other way around. And that felt like a breakthrough for me. But I feel like absurdity is something that is just always present. It's something that I don't have to work hard to include because it's always there, and it is kind of intrinsic to being alive. Like just the notion that we're all going to die, and we're like we have all these dreams and ideas and memories and things that we've lived through that nobody else can ever really fully know about, and where there's just so much to being a person or to being any kind of living thing, and then one day you're just going to turn into like mulch. Like you're just going to be turned into a pile of mulch, and your consciousness is going to disappear, and everything that you were is going to disappear. And there's just going to be like basically a pile of wet leaves where a human being was. Like for all intents and purposes, you're going to be compost. And, sorry to be upsetting, but, that's inherently really absurd. And a lot of other stuff in life is really absurd. Love is kind of absurd in a way. So I feel like I think what I would say is that I used to reach for absurdity and try to like, do like lift things up to the level of absurdity. I wasn't reductio ad absurdity. I was in a sense raising things to absurdity. I was like, let me heighten things until the things that are already exist that are absurd intrinsically, I'm going to show how absurd they are by making them bigger and more ridiculous. Like I did just write a short story that's coming out later this year where somebody has to somebody has to like appeal their case to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court shows up and it's 9 giant heads that look like kind of Zardoz. They're like referred to as 9 Zardozes. I don't know, everybody remembers the movie Zardoz with the big floating head. It's like, oh, the penis is evil, the god is good, or whatever. And so the Supreme Court is like 9 giant heads that are just like, oh, we are the Supreme Court. They just like descend from the sky. And that was an example of raising things to absurdity because the Supreme Court is already very absurd, but like imagining them as like 9 big robot heads is kind of just makes them more absurd. But I think I'm trying now to find like the inherent absurdity in just real everyday stuff because I feel like that's another way of thinking about absurdity. But I also think, you know, you can have absurdity at the margins and like tell a story where the main action of the story is quasi-realistic, but then there's details that are just like minor characters or minor events or minor things that are happening in, on the edge of the frame that are absurd, which I feel like is also very real. Like most of us go about our days. And, the example I think about nonstop because it just never stops being relevant is unhoused people who are, you know, sitting on the sidewalk asking for money or just trying to survive. And we all walk past them. And like, we're in a story about like, I'm going to get groceries, which is the most mundane thing. They're in a story about the world has just fallen apart, kind of, and they've been abandoned. And the social safety net turned out to just be like a few shreds of wet tissue, and society is blaming them for their own misfortune. And their situation between those two stories of like, I'm going to the grocery store to buy some eggs, and their story of like, what I just said, I can't repeat it. Their situation in a way is more absurd. It's not funny. It's not funny at all. But I feel like we exist in a world where there is absurdity that we sort of see in the corner of our eye. We try very hard not to look at it because we don't want to think about it. And I know I can think of other examples of things today where I've been glancing on social media and there are pictures that show up and I have to scroll past them really fast because it just upsets me too much to look at them. I feel like atrocities are absurd in a way. Like absurdity isn't always just like ha ha ha, like, this is so wacky. Atrocities are kind of inherently absurd too. And we live in a world where absurdity is increasingly a very dark thing and very Kafkaesque. Sorry, that took a turn. I'm sorry.
Your audio just cut out when you said sorry.
Okay, well, can you hear me
Oh,
now?
now I hear you. Okay.
Okay, great.
Yeah, I mean, I was just thinking about, again, the big giant, like absurd bad stuff. we lose the capacity to engage with it when it becomes so overblown, which is kind of what you were saying with fiction. If you're diving so far into the absurd that, this, like, you can no longer bring the stakes to a personal level. And it sounds like you've been kind of finding that happy medium there in your fiction.
Yeah, and that is a thing that I have consciously thought about, especially like the last like 10, 15 years of like the for lack of a better term, like small personal stakes against a huge backdrop. And that's kind of like a lot of my, like All the Birds in the Sky is kind of that. It's fundamentally a story about like these two people and whether they will work out their relationship. But there is like huge war between magic and science and magic. Sorry, war between magic and science happening in the backdrop, and like huge events are happening and huge bizarre events are happening. But we stay hopefully pretty focused on Lawrence and Patricia and their like intimate relationship, and a lot of that is hopefully pretty grounded. And I feel like that's a thing that I've been leaning into more of, like, yeah, it's another way of thinking about the thing I said about like you're going to the grocery store, but there's absurd things happening on at the edge of the frame.
Well, to take things in a slightly different direction, since you'd mentioned earlier, being curious about things, is there anything in particular that, you're feeling curious about and inspired about right now?
Oh wow. I mean, um, gosh, things I'm curious about right now. I mean, oh gosh, I can't think of something like the blood-brain barrier was something that I was super curious about, where I was like, I just really want to know all about this, and I'm going to make somebody come and talk to us on our podcast about it so we can understand it better. Um, man, um, I'm really curious to see what's going to happen with Fantastic Four. Like, actually, that's something that I mean, this is something where I'm like trying to like distract myself from the state of the world by obsessing about things that are, for me personally, extremely low stakes. Like, I don't, nothing, it doesn't affect me that much one way or the other. Like, I was talking to a friend about this the other day about like, not only are people going to want to see another Fantastic Four movie when we already got like multiple previous Fantastic Four movies that were kind of ranged from like okay to like pretty terrible. Um, but also, like, for average people who aren't like super fans of Marvel, are they going to just think that this is like a remake of The Incredibles? I don't know. I'm really curious to know what's going to happen with that movie, and like whether it's going to have any legs. I think Fantastic Four. I'm dying to find out. Like, I think it'll probably have a pretty good opening weekend, but then will people show up in the second weekend for it? I don't know. That's something that I'm. That's like my sports. Like, people follow sports, and I follow movie box office and stuff like that because like it doesn't really affect me directly. And yeah, literally the main thing I'm excited about with Fantastic Four is Pedro Pascal, because he is so great. And, I've just been so appreciative of him lately. And like, honestly, I've got a recommendation, everybody. A movie I watched a week or so ago that has Pedro Pascal in it that I can't stop thinking about is a film called Freaky Tales, which I guess it was in theaters for like 30 seconds, but now it's on VOD. You can pay like $5 or $6 and watch it on like, YouTube or, whatever, all the places you can rent movies online. And it's so good. It's such an interesting film. It's so well made. And oh, wow, holy cow. You're an extra in Freaky Tales. I'm not worthy. That movie is so incredible. I'm just like so obsessed with like thinking about genre, thinking about how that movie tackles all these different genres. And it's actually, oh wait, I think it's showing at the Grand. If you are in Oakland, I think they're having like a one-off screening of it at the Oakland Grand Theater this weekend, maybe, when I'm going to be in San Diego for Comic-Con. So you could go see it in the theater, Nicole. Um, so it's such a great movie. It's such a great movie. I love it. It's got like, action movie stuff. It's got like a segment that's just about these two girls who are trying to be rappers in the 80s, and like they go into a rap battle with Too Short, and it's like I had more suspense in that rap battle segment than I've had in like any action movie I've seen in the last 20 years. Like it's just so well made, and Pedro Pascal is so good in it. Like he's such a great actor, and he really brings his A game to this tiny little movie. And yeah, seriously, it's such a great film. It does. I do have one complaint about it, which is a spoiler, but there's an unfortunate trope that it kind of plays into. But even with that, I still highly, highly, highly recommend it.
We have one last question in the Q&A,
Yay.
which might bring us to our hour.
Okay.
And I read that you're a plotter pantser combo. How did that serve you or have to change for your trilogy? And how do you know if your idea is big enough to carry three whole books?
Oh my gosh. Love that question. That is such a great question. I might have to go more than 3 minutes answering that question because that's such a good question. I wish we'd gotten that question earlier because I could have talked for 20 minutes about that. But yeah, I mean, first of all, I just hate dichotomies. I hate binaries. I just hate them. I don't like, I'm sure that there are some that make sense in the world. Like, I guess there are certain dichotomies that make sense, like you want blood to be inside your body, not outside your body generally. But there's some certain basic things where like it's either this or that. But I mean, I guess blood can be inside and outside your body at the same time. But sorry. Anyway, I hate binaries and dichotomies. I don't think any of them are real. I think that even if you are like the most organized plotter and like outline everything in advance, there's still going to be stuff that you're going to get halfway through and you're going to be like, oh, this isn't working the way I thought. I have to really, and these characters are not doing what I thought they were going to do. And like vice versa, like you're always going to do some planning. Like I feel like it's a false dichotomy. I've definitely gone to different extreme, or I've definitely gone to different ends of what I think of as a spectrum over the course of my writing. And like, I will often like with something like All the Birds in the Sky, I was like just writing and kind of had some idea of where it was going. And oftentimes I'd be writing this part of the book, but I'd make a few notes for like what would happen like a few chapters later. But I would also have some ideas about where the story was going to end up. And like I would kind of work out stuff. I would also stop and like interrogate myself about like what is this story? And in the course of doing that, I would be coming up with ideas. So I feel like the way I've often worked in the past is kind of making it up as I go along, but also constantly trying to figure out where the story's going and often coming into it with an idea of like what the basic story is and what it's about and where I want to end up. But how you get there is always a little bit tricky. With the trilogy, that was an interesting process for a couple of reasons. One is I didn't want to embark on something that ambitious without having a really solid plan and really knowing what I was doing. But also I sold it to my publisher, to Tortine, based on like I think I had about 42,000 words written and like polished and in good shape, plus a synopsis of the first book and then a synopsis of the second and third books. And like I spent so much time working out that outline of the three books before I had sold it because I wanted to make sure that everybody knew that I was going to be able to pull this off. And so that was really important to me. Um, and then, you know, so I started out with a really strong outline, especially for the first book. Like the outline was very solid for the first book and pretty solid for the second and third books. And then stuff happened. And like, for example, like something that I do sometimes is I'll just open an empty Word file or an empty document and be like, this is going to be 5,000 words of Tina and the other kids hanging out on a spaceship and getting used to life in space. And it's going to just be like, we need some stuff of, once they're all on the spaceship, stuff of them just getting used to living on a spaceship together and like just doing stuff. And so I wrote like so much of just like different little scenes of Tina and her friends. And, at some point, one of those documents that I was writing of just like, oh, one of them was just like Tina and her friends go on some space adventures in the middle of the book before we kind of go to the like, things start getting really serious again and we're racing towards the climax. So I was like, we'll have a little bit of like, just like interesting little adventures in the middle. And what that led to was I was just writing like scenes of like, oh, we're fighting bad guys, stuff is happening. And I hit a part where Tina kills a couple of people, I think, and Tina freaks out. And I was like, oh. yeah, of course Tina freaks out. She's never killed anybody before. Killing people is really, really intense. It's not something that you should just treat lightly. And Tina really freaks out. And Tina kind of has a nervous breakdown about this. And basically, the upshot of that is that Tina, halfway through the first book, vows to never kill again. This is kind of a spoiler, but whatever. The books have been out for ages. And that kind of changed the whole second half of the book because suddenly it was like, oh, Tina has vowed to never kill again. Or, she does blow up a spaceship later in the book, this first book. So she does kill some people. It's a situation where there's no other alternative. But I think she disables one ship and she blows up one ship. I can't remember actually. But she is wrestling with it. She's wrestling with, do we have to kill? Can I be a hero without killing people? And like her whole thing is that she wants to live up to this heroic legacy of this person she was cloned from, who killed just like a ton of people. And so at the end of the book, she makes this decision: I am never killing again. I am a pacifist. No matter what, I will never take another life. And meanwhile, stuff happened with the other characters that just blew up my plans for the second and third books because I really wanted to keep developing these characters and not just have the supporting cast just be standing around being like, yes, you're so great, Tina. We're here to support you. And we don't have any lives or ideas of our own. Like, especially like it felt, especially with the other people from Earth, but even with some of the alien characters, I wanted them to have their own lives. And found out stuff about them that was interesting. And so basically, I ended up really throwing out my original outlines for the second and third books in a huge way and came up with something that I thought was way better. And now I think it's a billion times better. Like, I feel like there were things that I did in those second and third books that I just really love because I was willing to throw out that outline. And then I made new outlines and ended up deviating from those and just like, and so on and so forth. But I feel like to me, I'm always going to the process of writing novels is always going to be messy. And I feel like the messiness is part of what I like about it. And I like the thing of just like, yeah, here's a bunch of stuff happening and I'm going to see what comes out of it. And like, that feels more interesting than just like trying to like move straight ahead because I always want to get to know the characters better and have the characters kind of driving the story as much as possible. So that was a really long-winded answer. Thank you all so much. I really appreciate everybody who's hung out with me today.
Oh yeah, and as soon as you started talking about that series, I was like, oh, I could ask so many questions about these characters and things that have
Oh,
happened to them. But
oh my gosh.
thank you so much for joining us. You're always welcome to come back.
Yay.
And all of our guests, thank you for taking the time to be with us. Hopefully, you have learned something today that inspires you to go forth and write or read or otherwise support writers in your life. I just have some thank yous to King County for Culture, the City of Seattle Office of Arts and Culture, and the many, many donors in our community that help make these programs happen. And we've dropped some links in the chat already for where you can find more events, support writers in the Write-a-thon, and join the Discord. So thanks again, everyone, for spending this time with us.